Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm John Harney. Today we look at Crusader Kings 3, the latest from Paradox Interactive and the sequel to one of the best games ever made, not to mention a history nerd's dream, certainly this history nerd's dream. The new game is iterative to an extent, but it builds on the format in ways that are worth talking about and that I hope are particularly interesting to people with a vested interest in the depiction of history and the kind of the experience of playing history in video games. Let's get to it. For those unfamiliar with Crusader Kings 2, there's a History Respawned episode for you, by the way. It was essentially an interactive map of medieval Europe, at least at first, that invited the player to navigate their way through the decades as the leader of their own dynasty. So, in short, you did not control Ireland or the Frankish kingdoms or Venice, you controlled the family that ran those places, or who wanted to run those places, or were about to be defenestrated. The game expanded over the years to include more detailed environments, and thus more enjoyable playable scenarios, in the Middle East and India. Paradox developed expansions delving into different government types and more adventurous developments, such as, in one of their more divisive decisions, an invasion of Europe by an invigorated Aztec Empire. From a historian's point of view, Crusader Kings 2 was, frankly, fabulous. The focus on human action and interaction without succumbing to overly romantic depictions of huge, daunting figures standing astride the course of history, the general chaos of historical progression driven by the agency of hundreds of artificial intelligence characters and one human player, the filtering of that chaos into recognizable cultural and political difference and conflict. Crusader Kings 2, alongside other Paradox games such as Europa Universalis 4 and Hearts of Iron 4, captures the reality of global history. It's an impossible mess, really. Yet recognizable patterns can emerge and things do happen. The catch with all of this was that the game was incredibly difficult to get into. All of that fantastic historical verisimilitude did not amount to much if you gave up half an hour in after your vassals, apparently inexplicably, turned on you and left you in charge of about 200 soldiers in a small hamlet somewhere in northwestern Germany. So, for years now, I have told anyone who seemed even moderately interested they should play CK2, but warned them to be patient with it. Frankly though, it is tough. I could never, for example, use CK2 in class to demonstrate the complexity of historical dynamics. The game, at least for most of us, is just too hard to get into, and too unwelcoming. Crusader Kings 3 seeks to remedy that, and Paradox's attempts to pull this off in large part define the game's success. There have been a lot of tweaks in the user experience. The game starts you off with a tutorial in southwestern Ireland, perhaps a nod to the long-standing community use of the island as a beginner location, or just recognition that a small island on the edge of Europe is a great place to learn game mechanics without being overwhelmed too quickly. The tutorial does not take very long and does enough to show you that a lot of things have been streamlined. It is now, for example, much easier to wage war and actually have some clue what on earth is going on while you wage it. You will also be introduced to the tooltips. My god, these tooltips. Nerd heaven. Never did I think I could lose myself in tooltips. It's a wonderful example of UI design improving a game dramatically, and it kind of fits CK3's vibe, where the mechanics, and yes, they can get complicated, live in this kind of grey area between a human being playing a video game in 2020 and the extraordinarily complex, confusing, but very manageable and malleable feudal system, and in other communities, kind of clan system, of government. Beyond that, this video game is more, for lack of a better term, video gamey, at least in places. Your character and their heirs, who will in turn become your character, and so on and so on and so on, rely on a series of basic stats out of 20 determining their abilities in things like diplomacy and stewardship. Stewardship basically being collecting taxes and running the place. Your character is further shaped by various traits on top of that. These basic stats and traits combine to create colourful characters. Great warriors who struggle to direct traffic effectively in peacetime, sneaky charmers who had best lock themselves inside if an enemy army comes into the county, fantastic, almost game-breaking titans who define their dynasty for generations to come, and duds that you struggle through for a generation and have to work around for the most part. Crusader Kings 3 gives you a little more to work with in developing a character, with honest-to-God skill trees building on the basic stats. The mechanic gives you more control over your character, but mostly helps to actually explain what your character is good at, which in turn drives you to try things, like for example, constructing buildings in your territory. It takes a long time and is expensive, but if your character had developed a flair for project management, you were more inclined to build those stables and barracks across the land, rather than, mount another ill-considered invasion of Scotland. Similar to this, in fact perhaps the most video gamey thing in this video game, is the hook mechanic. You are now able to lean on NPCs, or just flat out blackmail them, and gain a hook, a completely abstracted game mechanic that you can choose to call in later. Hooks are a brilliant idea. They give shape to the existing conflict between characters in the game and spell out ways that your character can use his or her agency. Ultimatums can be refused, with possible penalties arising, up to and including war. Hooks can be gained through giving someone a choice piece of land or finding out through your spies that they are carrying on an affair with their most loyal general. This totally happens regularly in the game. These are not made up examples. Wonderfully, NPCs can, and do, gain hooks on you. They will even make something up to gain one. Only yesterday, a member of my court approached me with a threat to tell the world that my wife and I were related. You know, more so than was typical of royalty at the time. Luckily, my character was sufficiently learned to produce evidence disputing the lie. But otherwise, I was looking at being a victim of the mechanic myself. This step towards abstraction, rather than away from it, in my view, makes the game more interesting to play as a history simulator, as it were. The game itself is an abstraction anyway, and there's no point in fighting it. The beauty of the hook system is that it develops on and improves a central aspect of gameplay, that is, agency on behalf of characters player-controlled or otherwise. This was always the magic ingredient in Crusader Kings 2. History has been an absolute mess. Historians know this, and we seek to make sense of it, but we know we are sometimes largely on a fool's errand. Yes, of course there are trends and major events and all the rest, but we often find ourselves face to face with very important people whose decisions had a major impact on thousands, sometimes millions of others, doing inexplicable or confusing things. Human things, basically. Crusader Kings 3 embraces that complexity, not by modelling from an understanding of an overarching narrative executed from the top down, but by creating an environment where hundreds of micro-narratives coalesce from the bottom up. So many changes in this sequel illustrate Paradox's fundamental understanding of what the previous game did well. This results in a complex and highly enjoyable game. Take another example. Culture and religion have been markedly beefed up, and depending on your playthrough can intertwine rather pleasantly. In my first extended playthrough with the game, I was plodding along with the Murphy clan in Ireland, as one typically does, trying to unite our little island and balancing my dreams of a Celtic empire across the British Isles with a more achievable political harmony between Irish, English and Scottish thrones that might last a few centuries. When the Pope called the powers of Europe to crusade, I sent my modest force to help. The Irish fought in a crusade full of small armies from all across Europe that weren't terribly well organised. Not a bad reflection of the early crusades there, by the way, and laid siege to Jerusalem. I mostly wanted to give my general something to do, and was hopeful the Pope and I could bro down a little after, when it was all over, and I could hit him up for some money. Much to my shock, the crusade ended with my dynasty deemed the largest contributor to the war effort. My beneficiary, my sister Una, who I had named because I basically had no one else to, became the Queen of Jerusalem, upon which the game let me switch to her and made my character up to that point my heir. So I reigned as Queen of Jerusalem for a couple of decades before reverting back to my previous character when Una died. Except now my previous character was King of Ireland and King of Jerusalem, the dynasty spanning a mini-empire from the northwestern corner of Europe to the Levant. It was pretty cool and not entirely implausible. I do not think the Irish Jerusalem kingdom has much of a future though. Una spent her reign putting down rebellion after rebellion from vassals who weren't terribly fond of Catholics. I had the option to convert to the local culture, a move that included a religious conversion to Islam. This would have greatly improved my relationship with my vassals in the Middle East, would make me an immediate enemy of Europe. What to do? And that is the great success of this game. I could reign as a former Irish Catholic convert working to defend my new Middle Eastern kingdom from the inevitable assault from a pretty aggressive Christendom, or attempt to hang on to a hostile land full of people sick of the sight of me, and by the way, with some genuine cause, and my Catholic invading, some might say imperialist ilk. It is great, and when it all goes wrong, I can do it again. The secret to this game is that you are unlikely to win in a traditional sense. Though it is possible that you might unite all of Europe under your banner, it is more likely you will have interesting stories to tell, some of which will be stories of failure, some of which will flat out be hilarious. They stick with you. Making the player character just one among many in a huge world contravenes the typical video game law that the player is special, godlike. Now, you can still pick one of the more powerful people in the known, from a European standpoint, world, but he can get sick, he can die in battle. They can succumb to a plot or sire a complete moron as an heir. Welcome to real life. Crusader Kings 3 focuses relentlessly on characters that largely operate similarly within a web of parameters set by the game. So a Catholic character, for example, typically does not like female rulers. African kingdoms do not have the same government type as the French and Germans. In this regard, thankfully, Paradox kept a relatively light hand, and again you focus on dynamics. The African kingdoms have a government type with different expectations of its leader that allows troops to raid nearby territories and declare war somewhat easier. But so too do the Scandinavian kingdoms that can tear down into Western Europe to conquer and establish towns and cities of their own, which of course they did. The game's representation of its characters follows a game-wide model that acknowledges a European viewpoint driven by superiority as just that, a European viewpoint. The beautiful world map that illustrates Western Europe in loving detail and becomes ever more haphazard and vague the further east and south you travel. This is exactly what the maps from the medieval period were like. Muslim rulers do not like Catholics, but no more than Catholics dislike them. And if you do choose to give uniting Ireland a whirl, don't expect to be able to write letters to the rulers of Central Asia. They're too far away to contact, and truthfully, you do not know what is going on over there. It is a video game, and it bends history to its will to do video game things. But Crusader Kings 3 has built a sandbox within which some characters rise to glory, with a resolute focus on what they believe they can build given time and enough sacrifices from their own people and their enemies. It also features characters who would really rather just read, or eat a lot, or carry on a romantic liaison with someone that will hurt them both and many more people beside, you know, like real life. Now, I won't say like real life a third time, but I'll close by saying this. History is messy. History is hard to figure out. Facts happened. That's clear. Things happened at certain times. Certain people made certain decisions. And you know what? Louis XIV was a lot more important than some random butcher from northwestern France that you and I have never heard about. That's the fact of it. And this game embraces that. But I think Crusader Kings 3, in so many ways, you know, shows us what video games can do. That you can create your own narrative. Now, the weakness of this kind of a game is that it demands you create your own narrative. But I think the great, you know, upgrade, as it were, from Crusader Kings 2 to Crusader Kings 3 is that it is easier to do than ever. This game still needs a little bit of patience, but not as much as it used to, and you can really kind of get into it. You could open this game and say, right, I want to be someone who fights wars a lot, and you could have a lot of fun and figure it out. And along the way, you might learn a bit in passing about how the culture system works, the religion system works, so on and so on. And if the game really kind of sticks with you and you enjoy playing it, you'll find yourself playing it in different ways. And before you know it, you will enjoy playing the guy struggling to survive who might be able to get his house a slightly larger chunk of the southeastern part of modern-day Germany. You spend hours and hours in a game like that and really enjoy it. And if that happens, maybe you should come and talk to us about what it's like being an historian and getting really focused on specific areas and characters that you kind of, you know, fall in love with. That's how kind of history works. It's this evolving thing that we're discovering. Now, in the video game, you create it effectively for yourself, but you create that narrative for you. It's a great strength of the game, and I honestly just cannot recommend it enough. Thank you so much for watching. You can find us here at the YouTube channel or look us up on historyrespond.com. We also have a podcast that comes out regularly. You can find it on the site or in any podcast app that you like to use on your device. Furthermore, if you want to support this endeavor, which is completely non-profit and run by a couple of very busy academics, you can go to patreon.com/historyrespond and give us your support. Thank you so much for watching.